What are SAP Rise and SAP Grow, and how do they contribute to implementation failure? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For over 20 years, I have drafted and negotiated a variety of technology-related contracts and litigated failed technology disputes in courts across the country. So what is it? What is SAP Rise? Well, Rise with SAP Rise, it's a comprehensive, and this is how SAP sells it, a business transformation as a service package. It was introduced in 2021, and really it is designed to simplify and supposedly accelerate an organization's transition from its legacy system, R3 ECC, to a modern cloud-based ERP environment. And specifically for SAP, it's going to be S/4HANA. And the core concept behind it is, rather than being a single product, it's really a commercial bundle, and it's supposed to combine software, cloud infrastructure, and managed services into a subscription-based contract. And SAP, under that contract, acts as a single point of contact, and they're going to handle the technical system operations, service level agreements, and according to SAP, this is going to reduce the IT burden on the customer and make the implementation process and the transition easier. And so what are the perceived advantages? How does SAP sell this as an advantage? And I think what they do first is they say, well, it's going to simplify IT for you. It's going to offer a single contract, a single throat to choke, for example, for software, infrastructure, support. So it's going to reduce your need to manage multiple disparate vendors. It's going to provide a faster path to modernization. It's a faster route to the cloud for existing SAP users. So it's going to accelerate the adoption of new technology like artificial intelligence. And of course, it's going to utilize SAP's clean core strategy, which is essentially trying to implement the software with very few to no customizations, which according to SAP, and I think there's some truth to this, it's going to make it easier to upgrade, and it's supposed to lower the total cost of ownership for the life cycle of your utilization of that product. SAP also touts the cost savings with this. There's it can involve a high initial investment in potentially unpredictable ongoing costs if not managed well, and that's exactly what this is supposed to be able to do, is manage that total cost of ownership and reduce the cost and the complexity of it. It's, according to SAP, it's going to simplify the contractual structure, so you've got one contract with the underlying technical aspects and licensing would otherwise remain complicated and potentially opaque, but here you've got a simple contractual framework, and how advantageous is that? I don't know. I mean, I think having specific contracts dealing with specific scenarios, it can generally make sense. Some of the challenges, I think it still is going to require significant internal involvement of your IT department for the implementation, integration, and the management of that cloud environment, despite the fact that you're adopting this core SAP tenet. So that is Rise, and if you look at SAP Grow, that's essentially a very similar offering, but really designed for smaller businesses with a simpler technology need or technology stack. According to SAP, Rise, is supposed to offer these powerful capabilities, but it's certainly going to demand a commitment to change from the customer and a clear understanding of its comprehensive package. And so those are the perceived benefits. And I think the reality is that these programs, in my view, they really make the implementation project out to be something that is going to be simpler than it otherwise would be. And I'm not sure that there's really much of an advantage here. I think really what this is a marketing ploy. It's somewhat of a marketing gimmick to really make you think that they've mitigated the complexity of transitioning. And certainly they've got a vested interest in you transitioning to the cloud, and so they've adopted this marketing framework to make you more comfortable in doing that, and really try to sell you on that. I mean, that's where I think we're at with this. And so the disadvantages of that are really that it sets improper expectations. So now you think, well, it's not going to be that big of a deal. I'm going to be able to transition from ECC to SAP, S/4HANA, And it's, I've got, this special SAP program on my side, and that's going to really mitigate all my risk, and I don't need to really, do the level of due diligence that I otherwise would. I don't need to devote the same level of resources, and that I think is an incredibly bad mistake, and that is how, you really set yourself up for failure. Some of the other issues that are around these offerings, and I'll talk about Grow specifically. It only provides the public cloud version of S/4HANA, which is heavily standardized. It's not really suitable for businesses with highly specific needs or in unusual niches, or that have complex processes that require heavy customization. And I mean, if you're going to look at the SAP customer base, that's primarily what it is, right? I mean, certainly you've got the SMB market, but SAP's standard customers is going to be generally a Fortune 500 marquee company that's going to have a requirement for heavy customization. Companies, when they utilize this approach, they're forced to adopt pre-configured best practices. And the problem with that is that this concept of a best practice doesn't really exist. You've got SAP defining what the best practices in your industry are, and the reality is SAP is not in your industry, and they're not really going to have an understanding of what your specific best practices are, and those may differ from your competitors, and ideally they should. And the reality is if the best practices that are supposed to be baked into that software don't match what you perceive to be your competitive advantages, it's going to cause disruption. The other issue with this is there's just really limited customization. And that's by design. They don't want you to customize the software. And what's the purpose for that? Well, I think it makes the implementation easier. I mean, does it make the software better suited for you? Probably not. And if everybody's utilizing the same version of the software without any customizations, where's the competitive advantage? Where is the secret sauce that's going to make you stand out and make you different from your competitors? You've also got to realize too, I mean, if you're going to be adopting this approach and going hand in hand with this clean core, some critical functionalities, advanced manufacturing tools, third-party tools, they might just be missing from the software. And what are you going to be left to do? I mean, you're going to have to figure out how to customize that software in a way that still maintains its integrity. Is maybe simpler modifications that are going to not get in the way of your ability to upgrade and update the software on a going forward basis. But the reality is, I mean, implementations are hard. There's going to be data migration challenges. There always are. There's going to be, a loss of tribal knowledge. Key internal staff that are involved in the implementation, they typically, will leave the organization after the software has been implemented, leading to a shortage of expertise on how to manage that system. There's always going to be integration issues that need to be addressed. And so, the reality is that all of these things are going to be there, and to the extent that SAP wants to kind of sweep these things under the rug and say, well, look, it's not even a real software implementation. It's really just you're transitioning to S/4HANA from a legacy system, and you should want to do that because it's the latest and greatest, and you shouldn't worry about it because we've got processes in place that are going to mitigate the risk associated with it. So don't worry about it. And I think that's not a viable solution to this. And I think the reality is that if you're going to rely on SAP's representations, the likelihood that you're going to devote the necessary resources to that implementation that you otherwise would have is probably on the lower end. And I think that in and of itself is going to increase the likelihood that your ERP implementation, your transition to the cloud, is going to run into problems, and you're going to have some serious issues. You're going to have cost overruns. You're going to have budget timeline issues. You're not going to be on time. You're going to spend more money than you expect. You're not going to realize all the business benefits that you expect to realize. And I think that's just the reality of it. And, ERP implementations are always hard, and SAP is hard in particular. And that's exactly what these are supposed to mitigate. But I think if you take it on face value, good luck to you, because I think you're going to have some serious issues. If you have any questions about any of the issues in this video that we've talked about, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction.